I'm outside the Liverpool Disco Festival with Graeme Park, who's just finished DJing. So this is the third time you played for the Disco Festival, right? Yeah. What's your feelings on the event in total then?
It's a fantastic event because of, first of all, the venue, Camp and Furnace and District next door, and the fact it starts in the afternoon. It's very civilised. Well, it starts very civilised. It gets a bit messy as the day and the evening wears on, but it's a great venue and it's a great place to hear some great tunes.
How, because you've been DJing in Liverpool for a good 25, 30 years now. What's your relationship with the city like, you know, the clubs and the things, because it's gone from Cream up to the present day?
Well, I mean, I used to play in Liverpool way back in the 80s. I've forgotten where, but then when I started at Hacienda, that was my kind of relationship with Liverpool finished, because there's no way that you could do the Hacienda and Cream, and they were always trying to get me to come and do guest spots at Cream, but I said, well, I just can't. And literally the day after the Hacienda closed, Cream were on the phone saying, right, we want you to come and be one of our residents. And I said, yeah, go on then. And the thing is, that's how I met my wife, who was working for Cream, and that was 20 years ago.
Okay. So obviously you associate with Hacienda and Acid House, but disco is a sound. Can you remember the first disco record you heard, or the first time you fell in love with it as a genre?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate that my mum and dad used to always have music on, but my first vivid memory, well, I mean, apart from like hearing things like Chic and Sister Sledge on the radio, I remember in 1977 when I was 14, I vividly remember I was in Aberdeen visiting my granny, and I Feel Love by Donna Summer came on the radio, and it was like, what the hell is this? Because at the age of 14, although I'd always liked soul and disco, I was also really into The Clash and punk rock. And then this like kind of electronic madness that was I Feel Love made complete sense to me as someone who liked punk and kind of disco-y type things. And it just like struck a real nerve with me.
It's interesting you've been out, because I did a panel last night with Skiddle, and all the panellists were very pro early disco, so you know, the salsa, the strings and stuff. They weren't really feeling it when the synths came in. I mean, what do you prefer?
I can't have a preference. It's all about what works for you and what you like. I mean, one thing that being a DJ for 35 years has taught me, there's no point getting all kind of precious and possessive and about tunes. It's what I've always done, whether it's like a disco festival, whether I'm doing, like for example, later on tonight I'm in Leeds with Mike Pickering and Eric Murillo doing a Hacienda night. Last night I played a small gig where I played loads of really obscure late 80s acid house. It doesn't really matter. Personal preference, I think, is nonsense. You should play to the crowd in front of you. And to say that synths kind of spoiled disco is rubbish. Listen to D-Train, for example. I Feel Love, obviously. Look what Giorgio Moroder does. Music develops and changes, and people who get hung up on the old stuff is better or the original's better, I think that's rubbish. You know, always look forward. That's my view.
It's interesting you say that. One of the things that people always say, that acid house and house music is the bastard child of disco. So as someone who was, you know, integral in acid house, is kind of like, what do you see like the relationship between disco and house music as being?
Listen, acid house is absolutely the child or bastard child of disco, because people like Marshall Jefferson, Derek May, Kevin Saunderson, DJ Pierre, all those early Chicago and Detroit producers, they were getting hold of cheap synthesizers, right, and trying to recreate disco. But if you got like a cheap synthesizer, two synthesizers and a drum machine, what are you going to make? If you're trying to make something that sounds like disco, obviously it's going to sound like it does, like acid house. But they were also listening to the European electronic disco, you know, like Telex, for example, and Giorgio Moroder. So it was their interpretation of what disco was. And with the Hacienda Classical show that I've been doing for 2 years and about to do the third year, we've taken those tracks and kind of scored and arranged them for a proper full classical orchestra. And we realised that when you take the synth lines and reverse engineer them for a full orchestra, those guys, it's exactly what they were trying to do, trying to recreate what the orchestra were doing.
So obviously we talked about Hacienda, you know, acid house is kind of like the electronic, like, you know, rough and ready version of disco. But your Hacienda Classical project is like the opposite. So you've taken these rough, rudimentary club tracks that were made on electronic synths and things, and turned them into these like grandiose big band things. I mean, how has that gone for you as a project?
Well, again, like I said, if you take Promised Land, for example, with these lush strings that were played on synthesizers, and then you score and arrange them for a string section, and then they blast out on the stage with brass and woodwind and everything else, it makes you realise that Joe Smooth was totally knew what he was doing. Even the kind of more raw acid house tracks that we do, they translate really well to real live analog instruments. Now obviously there's a lot the orchestra can't do, which is what me and Mike Pickering are doing in the background, doing the kind of squelchy synthy sounds that an orchestra can't do, and most of the electronic bass, and of course things like 808 drum machines and 909 drum machines an orchestra can never do. So it's just getting the balance right. So it's getting the real live instruments doing, playing what the synthetic versions were, but with like some electronic stuff to back it up. And it's just been amazing. And every song we've chosen translates really well. It's like reverse engineering the track, and it just comes out as this amazing thing. Marshall Jefferson came to our first couple of shows, and where we did 3 of his tracks, and he just couldn't believe how incredible they sounded. And I'm like, well, Marshall, you knew what you were doing, and that just proves it,
Definitely. Okay. Final thing I'm going to ask. Obviously, disco's been around longer than me and you've been active, and it's been here since the 70s. And
well, to be honest, I don't think disco's been around longer than me.
Maybe not then. It's definitely been around longer than me. But I think obviously since it's sort of like 70s heyday, I'd personally argue that it's the most popular disco's ever been. As a DJ who plays that, and as you said earlier, you play to the crowd, do you think that in 2018 in the UK and beyond, disco is bigger than it has been ever since its inception?
Well, yes, it has, but the thing about disco, it's timeless, I think. In the 80s, and the early 90s, a lot of young producers were discovering Salsoul and Philadelphia International records and sampling them, and then you fast forward 20 years and a lot of young producers are discovering Salsoul and Philadelphia International and sampling them and reinterpreting them. That it's just a timeless type of music, and it's made for dance floors, remember, that's the thing. The only criticism I have is that a lot of young producers now are getting a bit lazy. So in the 80s, you'd listen to a disco record and go, I want to try and recreate that with cheap synths, and you go acid house or like Detroit techno. Today, people, rather than try and recreate it, they just sample it and loop it and re-edit it, which is fine, and those tracks work. But I would like to see more young producers going, right, I really like this salsa sound, I'm going to try and do my own version. That's the only little tiny criticism I have.
I think that's lacking, because obviously if you look at the last decade, you had LCD Sound System, Juan McLean, the DFA guys who were doing big bands influenced by disco. It's not really happening in 2018, is it?
No, but I'll tell you why. It's because people are inherently lazy, I think, and that's down to the technology. Musical technology is brilliant. It democratizes the whole process. But the difference is, in the 80s and 90s, and even the early 2000s, if you wanted to make an amazing record, it cost you a lot of money. You had to go and hire a studio for a start, and then often there was a lot of equipment that the engineer would say, well, you need to hire this in if you want to do this particular thing. So you'd hire stuff in. Then you'd have to go and find a record company to put it out. And then a record company would only put something out if they thought it would sell. So the A&R process was there. Whereas today, anyone who's at the Liverpool Disco Festival now, who's got a laptop with basic music software on and a connection to the internet, could go, I really love those tunes I've heard by that DJ, go home, throw something together using loads of like freely available loops and samples, and then release it on their own label before midnight. That doesn't mean it's going to be any good. I mean, there are good tracks that get made that way, but my inbox has got, like, the other day was 112 emails to my dedicated email address for music. How the bloody hell am I supposed to listen to all of those? I've got more other things to do in life. So I just think, I'm not knocking technology, it's brilliant. I mean, I just love the fact that instead of carting 2 crates of heavy records, around the world, I've got a USB and a pair of headphones. That is brilliant, right? And the CDJs I use are just incredible. You can do stuff you couldn't do on vinyl. But that doesn't mean that everything that everyone does is good. And when I see, I'm not going to mention names, but I got this tune sent, and all it was just a re-edit of an old disco track, and it said on the label, written and produced by the two guys who did it. And I'm like, no, you didn't write and produce it, you just edited it, and now you're trying to claim it as yours. That's slightly annoying. I'm not knocking it, I'm just a little kind of bone of contention.